love grass. No, not the kind you smoke, the kind you land on. I might know about the other kind, maybe. I probably didn't inhale. Anyway, Cubs love grass, and we've got this great little turf airport south of my home base called Buchan. I want to show you something about this runway. It's these markings here. Here's what it looks like from the air. Those are just old tires painted white, by the way, and they work for the runway edge markings. That's what's called a displaced threshold, meaning you're supposed to land beyond the second set of markers. The idea being that there are obstacles off the approach end, and a longer landing will force a glide path to clear them. But you're allowed to use the full length for takeoff. Well, I do that and then some on this runway. It's about 2,000 feet long, which is plenty for a Cub. But on the theory that you can never have enough altitude after takeoff, I taxi past the first threshold and use every inch of available runway. The thing about flying is that the skills involved are perishable. That's both the motor skills, the stick and rudder required, and the required judgment. Somewhere in the distant past, I'm sure I learned to use full length, always. But a few years ago, I was flying with my airplane partner Jack, who lives in that house right over there, and he reminded me there's rarely a good reason not to use full length. So in this video, we're going to look at an accident where failing to use the entire runway was a factor in a chain of mistakes that led to a fatal crash.
So there's a lot to unpack here because, like so many aviation accidents, this one had a chain of faults. Let's start with the airport, the Charles B. Wheeler Downtown Airport in Kansas City. I flew in there once and I think everyone just called it downtown. It was the original home base of TWA during the 1930s, but it was never going to expand much because of its location in a tight bend in the Missouri River and the close proximity of downtown Kansas City. During the 1960s, the FAA called it the most dangerous airport in the country and declined to spend developmental dollars on it. Today, it's a busy general aviation airport with terrific access to downtown Kansas City. Because of its location, the layout is a little quirky. There wasn't room for a perpendicular cross runway, so the shorter runway is only 30 degrees off the main runway heading. Not a lot of help in a strong winter westerly. This wasn't a factor in this accident, but the airport layout didn't help either, as you'll soon see. Here's the accident fact pattern. The pilot of a Mooney M20J, that's a 201, flew into downtown airport 3 days before the accident, and on the return flight, he fueled at the self-serve pumps, which are here. Then he taxied to runway 19 for an intersection takeoff at taxiway Kilo. That gave him 5,300 feet of runway, but he left 1,500 feet behind him. After takeoff, the pilot retracted the landing gear, and shortly after that, witnesses said the Mooney's engine quit. The pilot reported that on the tower frequency. When the airplane was about 10 feet above the runway, the gear still in the wells, the engine recovered, and the pilot said he was okay. He resumed the climb. The engine quit again at about 300 feet, and the airplane entered what appeared to be a turning stall and crashed in this area just short of the river. Both the pilot and the passenger aboard were killed. In its final report, the NTSB said the probable cause was the pilot's decision to continue the flight after the initial engine stoppage, and contributing causes were his premature retraction of the landing gear and what appeared to be water contamination in the fuel. This conclusion is supported by the data, but I'm going to go a little rogue here on what I think was the real cause of the fatality, which was barely mentioned in the report. I'll get to that in a minute. Backing it up here, if water was the cause of the stoppage, it's a bit of a mystery how it got into the Mooney's tanks. The original NTSB report said the airport had over an inch of rain while the Mooney was parked, but later amended that to say just a trace. It's possible that there was already water in the tanks when the pilot arrived, or that a trace was enough to accumulate a sufficient slug of water, or that the airport fuel supply was contaminated with water. but the NTSB found no evidence of that. Or that something else caused the engine to quit. I got a six-figure insurance check for this Mooney we owned in a partnership. It flopped into a swamp after the engine quit on takeoff, similar to the Kansas City accident. But the pilot, who happened to be one of my partners, was, well, I'll let him tell you what happened. In the Zoom window here is Dana Nickerson, who was my partner in what I call the swamp Mooney at this point. Dana, refresh my memory on what happened here.
Sure, Paul. We were taking off out of Beaufort, South Carolina. Had just gotten some fuel, and at about 400 feet coming off the runway, the engine quit. The first thing I did was to put the nose down, to trim to 70 knots, and then start a gentle right-hand turn towards the airport. Well, it turns out also there was some open space there as well. There was a mobile home park in front of me, and there was some industrial buildings off to the left. So the swamp was the best place to go into. I then checked the fuel, I checked the mags, I checked the seat belts, and then I asked my passenger to open the door and jam a code in there. We did all of this within 7 seconds because it was just a very quick from when the engine quit till we were actually landing in the mud. The one thing I do remember is went through my mind is to keep flying until the crunching stops. Because as we were sliding in the mud, the tail came up a little bit, but I just kept flying the airplane until we stopped. I'll say that putting the nose down was really critical, and the reason why I did that is because it was instinctual. Paul, when you and I used to go out and practice, I remember taking off on a very windy day one day, and you said, "Oh, watch out for that airplane," and then you pull the power back. And I kind of hesitated for a second, and you were yelling into headphones, "Put the fucking nose down!" And that's, what I did. So I had this instinctual memory to get the nose down. It is extremely fast from when the engine dies until when you have to be flying the airplane. And the other thing I'll say is that it's really critical to keep flying the airplane. Every fiber in your body wants to pull the nose back as you see the ground rushing up at you because it's coming up faster than it normally is. But you have to maintain, in this case in the Mooney, 70 knots and just glide it right in and let it settle in for a landing.
Well, all that training, I guess, and you reminded me, we went out in some pretty sporty conditions. I guess it paid off.
Absolutely. In fact, quite honestly, it's what saved our lives. If I had hesitated even a fraction of a second, I'm fairly certain the airplane would have stalled and we would have been another spin stall accident statistic.
There were no injuries in our crash, and no reason for the stoppage was ever determined. Our Mooney accident wasn't all that unusual. Lycoming-powered Moonies and airplanes equipped with the Bendix RSA fuel system appear in a handful of engine failure accident reports. While these reports often find no reason for the failure, many cite water contamination as the cause, whether the engine is RSA equipped or not. There are 4 or 5 such accidents every year, so let this remind you, sump the tanks for water, always. In an accident report that seems to have a little of everything, the investigators also hit on the Mooney's flush fuel caps. These caps fit into a recess in the top of the wing with a locking lug to seal them. They have a rubber O-ring to keep water from flowing into the tank, but if the O-ring is old or missing, the caps won't seal. They'll also leak if you don't seat the cap correctly. The NTSB found that the accident airplane's O-rings had been recently replaced, but there was no evidence that they were leak checked. When the investigators tested the caps by pouring water over them, they appeared to leak. Case closed, right? Well, not quite. Although the NTSB found no fault with the engine magnetos, the family of the crash victims sued Continental Motors, they're the ones who made the magneto, on the grounds that the magneto had faulty gaskets that caused the timing to slip, stopping the engine. The magneto in question is one that's not a favorite of many pilots, the Bendix D-Mag. In case you're not familiar, most aircraft engines have two magnetos with independent drives, the idea being that this improves reliability. The Bendix D-Mag uses a single drive that incorporates both magnetos in a single housing. You can see why pilots aren't fond of it. The jury didn't like it much either, and it awarded at least $9 million in damages to the Kansas City crash victim's family. And in case you're wondering, our Mooney had conventional magnetos, not the D-Mag. Whatever the reason for the engine stoppage, there are some ADM survival techniques here. ADM, aeronautical decision making. ADM is, if nothing else, all about having as many options as possible. The NTSB thought the pilots retracting the landing gear prematurely was an accident factor. But let's break that down. If you've just taken off and the engine quits and you're down to 10 feet, as the accident report says, are you really cognizant of whether the gear is up or down? And how does that relate to deciding to land on the remaining runway? In this accident, the pilot was halfway down a 5,000-foot runway and probably had sufficient runway to land. Whether the gear was up or down should be irrelevant. Remember, we're just trying to get out of this alive. The airplane is both expendable and insured. As I've pointed out in another video, gear up landings are all but 100% survivable. If you bring that fact aboard ahead of time, it could inform a split-second decision like this one. If the runway looks a little short, so what? Leave the gear up, the rollout will be a lot shorter, but you'll live to talk about it. The pilot faced a difficult scenario of a dead engine that suddenly comes back to life. From the comfort of an armchair, it's easy to say, just ignore that, close the throttle, and land on what you've got. But like it or not, that is the best survival decision. The engine quit for a reason, and better to find out why on the ground than another quarter mile downrange, even if the airplane gets dented in the process. Take that on board, and it might inform your decision if this ever happens to you. The pilot accepted an intersection takeoff from taxiway Kilo, giving up 1,500 feet of runway length. I suspect pilots coming from the west ramp at downtown do this all the time and never have issues. Had there been a parallel taxiway, he could have taxied to the end of 19 or crossed to the east side of 19 and in 3 more minutes of taxi time been at the beginning of runway 19 for a full-length departure. Aviation aphorisms usually get up my nose, but one that rings true in this accident is that the 3 most worthless things in aviation are fuel left on the ground, runway behind you, and altitude above you. When I first read this accident report, I was trying to think of a circumstance where I'd want less rather than more altitude on a takeoff. I got nothing. A full-length takeoff would have presented the pilot with 1,500 more feet of runway and a little more altitude, and that just offers more options. That's not to say there aren't good reasons for intersection departures, because there are. Say, for example, you're taking off behind a couple of airliners. Nothing wrong with trading the minor risk of less runway length for avoiding the wake turbulence of 2 airliners. Report ready to go and take the intersection takeoff. So in this accident, it may be true that contaminated fuel caused the stoppage, or maybe it was the magneto. It doesn't really matter. What caused the fatality was loss of control, followed by a stall spin. There are about 60 stall accidents a year in general aviation, and half of them occur on takeoffs. I place loss of control above the other factors for this reason. Just because an engine quits, that's not an automatic death sentence. If you maintain control of the airplane, the probability of survival is much higher, if not absolutely assured. Here, the aircraft might have ended up in the river or on top of the flood control levees. Either would have been more survivable than a stall spin. So here's where I deliver on the clickbait title with a takeoff survival checklist. Sump the tanks for water. Always. Never skip it. Use all of the available runway because, well, you never know. If the runway length is marginal, crack the POH and look at the performance tables. There are apps for this. It's possible the airplane just won't do what you want it to do. Think about what you'll do if the engine quits and do that down here, not up here. Have a plan. I've developed the habit of reminding myself on every takeoff that this time the engine will no shit quit and I'll be ready for it. Last, practice it. Build that post-failure pitch down into muscle memory, because if you do nothing else, just pitching the nose over will keep you in the game for what comes next. A survivable landing, not a stall spin. For AVweb, I'm Bertorelli. Thanks for watching.